Well, good afternoon. I know you all are going to sleep after this beautiful lunch there, right? No? Okay, well, there are some exciting presentations, especially the first half of this afternoon. So, as you can see, the three distinguished professors are sitting here to deliver some knowledge for you guys. So, let's start this session of this water, planet, and water crisis. And this session is titled Coupled Natural and Human Systems for Sustainable Water, Food, and Energy. We have three speakers bring three different distinct topics. Let me introduce the first speaker. It's Professor Ximing. He's the professor here in Civil and Environmental Engineering Department. He is the Harry F. and Frankie M. Lowell Endowed Professor at the University of Illinois in Civil Engineering. His current research areas include coupled human-natural system analysis with an emphasis on human interference in hydrological processes, water, energy, food system modeling, and especially in dry areas and sustainable water resources management, particularly in developing countries. Dr. Kai holds a BS in Water Resources Engineering and an MS in Hydrology from Tsinghua University, Beijing, and a PhD in Environmental Engineering and Water Resources Engineering from University of Texas in Austin. And I just told them they have 20 minutes. Each of them will speak, and we will hold our questions towards the end. And I also told them if one of them goes 21 minutes, other one will only get 19 minutes. So Dr. Kai, it's your time. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So actually, my talk is not a direct talk on water. I'm going to talk about something related to post-harvest food loss and waste. So I will try to talk about some implications of this issue, this food issue, to resources and also to engineering solutions or to policies. So let me first acknowledge the co-author of this talk. This is Majid Shafi-Jod. He's a PhD student in my group. All right. So this world still faces the grand challenge of food security due to many factors, many driving forces such as population growth, dietary changes, and also bioenergy expansions, climate change, and so on. So traditionally, we have been working on some engineering solutions to close the field gap or to increase the resources efficiency in order to address the grand challenge. But today, we are talking about a paradigm shift from production expansion to more efficient management of products, and that is to prevent food loss and waste. All right, so food loss and waste, there are many definitions today. So usually we refer that to decrease in food, including both quantity or quality, that was originally intended for human consumption at any stage of food supply chain. And usually we need to differentiate food loss and food waste because they occur at different stages and also associated with different causes. So food loss usually occur at the early stage, like harvest, handling, storage, processing, and they are related to, mainly related to the infrastructure, like storage and transportation. But food waste it happens in later stage and is more related to like the market strategy and also the habits or behavior and those things which affect people's behavior in food table. All right. So food loss and waste, this is not really a new issue for today. Back to 1970s, so FAO already tried to promote some solutions to mitigate, to reduce food loss and waste. And then right after that, there was probably because of the Green Revolution, there was a trend of food price declining, and then it looks like people kind of forget about the food loss and waste until more recently, around 2006 or 2008, the food price increases to a high point, and then around the world we have some famine problems. And then this issue of how to prevent food loss and waste becomes important again. So it is obviously important, okay? Because basically, if we could reduce the loss, and that means we could save some resources, and it really doesn't make much sense if we increase the production where we keep wasting some of the food. Okay, so my talk today, in the following, I will try to focus a little more on the resources and energy consumption. So first, let's look at how much is the food loss and waste. And in this table, you can say this is a loss or waste per capita, is a kilogram per capita. And also, I gave the numbers, the percentage in terms of the total production. As you can see here, in terms of the kilogram per capita, developed countries have higher number. But it is kind of surprising. If we talk about the percentage of food loss, we don't see much change between developing countries and developed countries. And actually, we have the highest number in North Africa and West and Central Asia. All right. Then this figure just gives you what is for different regions around the world, how much is the food waste, how much is the food loss. And it is very obviously, there is a very clear distribution of the waste and loss. You can say in developed countries, usually the waste is the waste is lower, but also the food loss is higher. But in developing countries, you can say that in some developing countries, it is almost the food loss is most of that. All right, and here we compare two regions. One is in the sub-Saharan Africa, and the other one is North America and the Oceanic. So you can say at different stages in production, processing, and also the consumption. In different stages, there are different distributions of food loss and waste. So in general, in developing countries, we have a lot of loss in the early stage due to the insufficient infrastructure. And in developed countries, we have a lot of waste in later stage in food consumption. All right. So now we are thinking about the implications of to reduce food production, food loss and waste, and this in this diagram basically we can find out some links between food production and resources. So if we could reduce the food production, the post-harvest loss and waste, we might be able to save some resources. We might have some positive social and economic impacts. Right? All right. So regarding the water, land, and fertilizer used to produce the amount of post-harvest food loss and waste, so this figure provides you some numbers, and globally, we can find some average number. We have 24% of water and about 23% of land and fertilizer is used to produce the amount of food which is eventually lost or waste. So let's just focus a little more on the water. So in this diagram, in this figure, we show the water use for food production, and also the water use for that amount of food which is lost or waste, and by these diagrams, and this black line shows that is the water is the percentage of water for food loss and waste over the total amount of water use. So it is surprising. It is really surprising. If you look at those developing countries and particularly dry areas like North Africa and West Central Asia, there is water scarcity problem is very, very, very serious over there. But the water used for food loss or waste is almost the highest. Okay. All right, so we also think about the energy used, which is associated with the food loss and waste. And this figure is from a paper published in 2010, and it gives for different crops, what is the total energy use, and what is the energy used for the waste or lost part. And for the whole country, this country, about 25% of the total energy for food production occurred with food waste. And also that energy embedded in waste food represents about 2% of annual energy consumption in the US. It looks like a small number, but actually that's a lot of energy. And 2%, that's actually even more than the energy we could get from ethanol today. Okay. And also we could differentiate the energy use for loss and waste. So on average, the consumer food waste is equivalent to 8 times more energy waste than post-harvest loss. So that means in the food waste, in later stage, particularly in food consumption stage, if waste happens over there, then we are basically wasting more energy. Okay. All right, and we also look at the carbon footprint with food loss and waste. And basically they have, we found they have comparable regional distributions. But we also found different patterns in developed countries and developed regions and developing regions. The percentage of carbon footprint is more than the percentage of food loss and waste in developed countries. And in developing countries, we just have the opposite. Right? Okay, so now we know some numbers about the waste. And we also know some distribution of waste and loss in different regions. And then we think about what could we do and what is the implications for engineering, for technology, and for policy. So I would start this with a project funded by ADM Post-Harvest Loss Prevention Institute, and the project was conducted in civil engineering. So in the beginning, we thought about what could civil engineering do for this project to prevent the food loss. And after we thought for a while, we figured out a lot of ideas. We just think about actually our materials group could develop some more cost-effective materials to improve the storage. Our transportation group works on supply chain to save energy and to prevent the loss. And our environmental group, they work on the temperature sensor or the fungus sensors. And they try to use these sensors in developing countries. That means the sensors should be really cheap. And the water group, we try to develop some programs to support the use of climate forecast for harvesting timing. And also we have done some assessment, the environmental and resources impact assessment for that. And actually, this project was already done, but we really, a group of civil engineers, we really enjoyed in doing this project because actually, traditionally, we worked on bridges or highways, large buildings. But today, we also realized we could actually contribute to some very fundamental issues in sustainability. All right, so in terms of infrastructure, that's mainly refers to storage and transportation. So we actually, the figure here just show you the different stage, different processes, and with some pictures. And the effective storage at the house level, those that storage is probably more important than what we can imagine. Because normally if farmers, if they don't have good storage in home, so that means they have to sell most of their harvest right after most of food right after the harvest. And then maybe in a few months they have to buy food from the market using a higher price. So that means the storage in home might affect their income. On the other hand, actually we visited some home storage in India, and this storage is not really nice. And when food is stored over there, probably very soon they will get quality problem. There was some quality degradation. So that ended with some health problem. So the storage is really important at all levels, not only at the home level, but also at the market and also some large scale storage issues. So in terms of technology, we could have all kinds of techniques, physical, chemical, and biological. And the major issue is that for developing countries, how could we make those things cost effective? Because usually farmers, based on their income from food, they may not be able to afford expensive technology. And also, the technical solution should be adapted to local situations. So, for example, in some places, energy limitation is an issue. Okay, then the technology design should consider about that. In the next slide, actually, I'm talking about some energy use and also energy saving involved in different processes. For the energy, we do need a lot of energy for drying during storage, particularly for grains. And we also, for fruits and vegetables, and usually we need cold chains to manage the temperature. And also for supply, sometimes we need to guarantee the shipment for absence of delays. So that also involves some energy use. But we also could have a lot of energy saving measures. So for example, in some rural areas, we can think about zero energy storage. So for example, the evaporative core storage, and that has been discussed in some recent papers. And also the optimal design of food supply chains, that has a lot of implications for energy saving. And reduce water and fertilizer, that will directly and indirectly end with some energy saving. Okay, so that's about energy. And now a little bit about, I mentioned we developed a model to use weather forecasting information to improve harvest timing and scheduling. So the food loss in the field and also at the household level, that pretty much depends on the weather with the harvest. There are some examples in the literature about that. So actually, it could significantly affect the rate of food loss. So we try to combine some weather forecast model with some biochemical and physical simulation model, and to develop some decision framework to suggest the harvesting date. Okay, and also information technology. Today, information technology with some relevance of big data. A lot of talks about that today. So that also could help on agriculture and particularly here on food loss and waste. So that includes like information delivery, some kind of on-time information delivery through internet or through webs. Internet or webs, and all the information share among stakeholders. And particularly, it is very important to deal with the oversupply or over-demand. So basically, if you think about the losses at the retainers, if there is some information on the demand, on a more accurate demand for retainers, that could prevent some loss. Right? Okay, and then I'm just talking about different solutions which might be able to use to reduce the waste. There is also some suggestions on assistance approach. And this systems approach is actually based on the concept of waste management. Okay? So if we have wasted food, how could we use that? How could we? There are different ways. And interesting way is to say we might be able to convert some wasted food, some food with degraded quality, into biofuel. And actually, recently in Europe, there were a lot of discussions about that. For example, that's in Ireland. They said the potential renewable biogas from food waste is equivalent to 2.8% of transportation fuel. So that's quite significant. Right? All right. Now, let's assume we do those things. We save the resources. We reduce the waste, and indirectly we save the resources. And then what could we do? We could do a lot of things, shift between rain-fed and irrigated crops, and we could allocate land to other purpose, such as the wind turbines or solar farms. So we can also, now around the world, there is some effort to close the yield gap, and we know so we know those gaps are limited by either by nutrient or water or other factors. So if we could save nutrient, save water in some places, we might be able to fill the yield gap. And finally, policies. So currently, based on the literature we have reviewed, there is not really a clear policy about either the demand management. So the demand management, that's mainly with the developing countries with infrastructures, with insufficient infrastructures. Or this is a supply management in developing countries, or demand management in developed countries. They have different policy implications. So how could we move beyond the target setting to address the underlying causes? So we have to resolve this issue before we start some measures. Okay? And then also for the policy assessment, we could do some, based on the work which has already been done, we could do some integrated assessment. So let me just be brief on this part. Finally, I have some quite straightforward remarks. So what I try to argue here is the food loss and waste reduction could be an effective solution to actual agricultural sustainability. And the reduction implies a great potential for resources conservation, including land, water, and nutrient, and energy. And also it provides fruitful implications for engineering, technology, and policies. And finally, as I just mentioned, we need clear policy incentives for engineering development and technology adoption. So once the policy is there, engineering will be really quick. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kai. It's very time-appropriate talk. You know, if any of you would like to know more about post-harvest loss, food loss, the University of Illinois is also arranging the first International Congress on post-harvest loss reduction, the first week of Rome, Italy, from October 4th through 7th. So, and it not be. Let me put this presentation first. I forgot to introduce myself. If you have any questions, my name is Prasanta Kalita. I'm a faculty here in agricultural and biological engineering. I also work with some aspects of water, mostly water management, irrigation, and this topic that Dr. Kai just said, discussed about post-harvest loss. I work for that institute right now, ADM Institute for Prevention of Post-Harvest Losses. So our next speaker is also a lot of emphasis on international work. Professor George Hornberger. His presentation title is Frontiers of Food, Energy, Water, Trilemma. Never heard that word before. Sri Lanka as a microcosm for Tradeoffs. Professor Hornberger is a distinguished university professor at Vanderbilt University, where he is also the director of the Vanderbilt Institute for Energy and the Environment. He has shared appointments as the Craig Philip Professor of Engineering and as Professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences. His work focuses on coupled natural-human systems and it aims to understand how climate, groundwater, surface water, energy production, food production, and human abstraction of water interact in complex ways. Dr. Hornberger received his BS and MS from Drexel University and his PhD in hydrology from Stanford. Dr. Hornberger.
Thank you, Prasada. Good afternoon, everyone. As you see, the first thing I should mention is co-authored Deb Perrone. She and I collaborated on this work, and Deb is now with the Water in the West program at Stanford. At any rate, I want to talk to you a little bit today about some of our work in Sri Lanka. So I'm sure that the people here don't need any of this background, but for completeness, I added just some general comments here. We all know part of why we're here for this water crisis congress, is that we really do have significant issues. Pressures on fresh water have grown, expected to continue to grow. Some projections suggest that because not just of population growth, but diet changes, it's likely that we'll need to double food production by 2025. And clearly this will mean that we're going to have to engage in more irrigated agriculture. It will be essential, as the bottom line there says, that for farmers to grow more food with less water, despite the stresses of climate change. So these are some of the issues that we have been talking about for the past, today and even starting last evening with the keynote address. And that is the trilemma just refers to three things and the connections between food, energy, and water. And we've argued that water is actually quite central to this, that water often drives some of the trade-offs that are forced on this. And this just depicts in a sort of pictorial form, some of the things that we've talked about, that water is certainly needed for energy, energy is needed for water. There are energy inputs to agriculture. There are biofuels affect the energy sector clearly. And then, of course, there we put in the center, urban centers as urbanization grows. Stresses on water resources can really lead to some of these conflicts. So the project that this work stems from is agricultural decision-making and adaptation to precipitation trends in Sri Lanka. That's a rather tortured phrase, but we wanted to get to a decent acronym for our project. It's a collaborative, it's an interdisciplinary project from left to right. The photos at the top, Amanda Carrico is a social psychologist at the University of Colorado. Hopefully you recognize the second person. Heather Truelove is a social psychologist at the University of North Florida. Jim Fraser is a sociologist at Vanderbilt in the Education School. And Jonathan Gilligan is a climate scientist. And our contention is that looking at Sri Lanka, we consider it somewhat of a microcosm of some of the emerging stresses on fresh water that exist throughout the world. And because of the nature of it's an island, there's self-contained in many ways, and so to a certain extent we can study this in ways that it would be quite difficult to tease apart some of the relationships, even though they exist in other areas. I like this. I took this photo when I was in Sri Lanka one time, and so it's not new that, of course, humans want to use water. So here was a king in the 12th century indicating that water is there and we should use it for the benefit of humans. And of course we still do that. So just a quick overview. The agricultural sector in Sri Lanka is not a huge part of the GDP, 11%, but 33%, at least 33% of the employment. I've seen figures that are higher than that. It's dominated by rice production. Something like 61% of the farmers grow rice. And as you see, rice cultivation consumes more than 70% of the water allocated for food production. One of the key things is that Sri Lanka is self-sufficient with respect to food. It's a policy implemented at the highest level. Paddy rice cultivation is the key, is a primary activity. Our work is concentrated in the Mahaveli watershed. The Mahaveli watershed is a very large watershed in Sri Lanka. I guess just a little background, the green colors on the map, the dark green is referred to as the wet zone, the medium green is the intermediate zone, and then the light green is the dry zone. And of course, dry is a relative term. As you see, we don't necessarily think of 1.5 meters of annual precipitation as dry, but of course it's seasonal, and that's really what matters. The Mahaveli watershed is designed for irrigation specifically. It feeds, as you see, 1,000 large and small tanks. I refer to them as tanks. We would probably recognize them as reservoirs. I think it comes from the Portuguese Tanque, which means reservoir, basically. And you can see it provides irrigation to 3,500 square kilometers. So the Mahaveli, though, is not just used for irrigation, for rice irrigation. It's a major supplier of electricity. And so particularly in the 70s, the emphasis shifted to hydropower, high fuel prices in the 70s. Those of you with as much gray hair as I have remember that, actually. For the rest of you, it's history, but the 70s were a time of high fuel prices. And hydroelectricity supplies a significant amount of the country's power, 90% in 1990, but it dropped to something on the order of 40% today. So when there's plenty of water, there's plenty of water, and there's enough water for irrigation, and there's enough water for hydropower, and who cares? But there's not always enough water. And so this is fairly recently, 2 years ago, there was a very significant drought, and you can see that the headlines in Sri Lanka were not dissimilar to some of the headlines we're seeing about California here today. So our research question, one of our major research questions, the research question I'm going to talk about today, is under conditions of water scarcity, how do these trade-offs get made? So how do decisions about water for rice and water for electricity get made, and what are the implications? So the Mahaveli system has two major diversion points. And so you can see that no, you can't see, because I don't have a topographic map. So if I had a topographic map here, the high part of the country is in the central highlands. This is where the topography is right for large dams. There are a series of large dams that are built along the main stem of the Mahaveli, but there is a diversion canal to send water north toward the dry zone, and you can see these beige-colored areas to the north are referred to as systems. There was a move, I don't have time to go into the history, but there was a move in the latter half of the 20th century to move population to the dry zone with the promise of supplies of irrigation water so that they could grow rice. There's a second diversion point to the north that can send water more toward the east or continue north. We sometimes refer to the ones to the north, something called System H, as a flagship system. It was the home province of the former president, the last political I don't want to say regime, but he was in for a long time, and he was from that area, and he solicited a lot of votes from farmers. And so we loosely refer to that as a flagship system. Okay, so more schematically, you can see here on the left-hand side, the water is routed down through a series of fairly large reservoirs. The diversion to the north, the sort of first horizontal line, that's the first diversion point. There is some hydropower that is done. It's a lower head hydropower. So roughly speaking, if the water is diverted down the main stem of the Mahaveli, it's about 70% of the hydroelectric power production and about 30% of the rice, and vice versa for diversions going more toward the north and east. So one of the challenges of working in, I'm sure not just Sri Lanka, but for us Sri Lanka, is data availability. It's not quite the same as just going to your local Met office and getting everything you need for free or nearly for free. And so there are some challenges. So we very much simplified this system. And what you see is the stars here are the two diversion points. We refer to them as D1 and D2. And basically, again, just to sort of reiterates that if we route flow immediately from left to right here along the main stem, we get about 70% of the hydroelectric power, 30% of the rice. Going north, if it continues to go north, it goes to this flagship system. If at the second diversion, D2, if it goes farther east, you would gain a little bit more hydroelectric power, but not that much. Because of the data limitations, our analysis is very simple. We are only going to look at a scenario of low flow where we talk about the amount of water diverted. Oh, maybe I have it on. Well, I don't. The amount of water diverted, and we're just going to assume that that water goes to produce hydroelectric or it goes to produce rice. And in some cases, of course, both. You don't use up the water by running it through turbines on a dam. To look at the production, we looked at the results for hydroelectric power per million cubic meters put through the turbines. Very nice relationships for all of the turbines. As we would anticipate, we know how electricity is produced, and we could use those relationships to calculate how much power would be produced by running the water in a certain way. Paddy yields are something else, of course. They're subject to a lot more variability for various things. We pulled together all the data we could. It's an approximation, and we basically fitted a curve to determine paddy yields as a function of paddy duty, which is the amount of irrigation water, the depth of irrigation water provided. This is our scheme then, and the only important thing I think for you to understand the rest of my talk is we looked at scenarios of diversion at D1 and diversion at D2, and we decided, well, we did the calculations for 0% diversion, 50% diversion, 100% diversion. So we basically wanted to calculate how much power could be produced, how much rice could be produced using a variety of choices. And what that allowed us to do, and this is for low flow conditions. For high flow conditions, there's enough water for everything. It's not a worry. But in low flow conditions, under drought conditions, there are trade-offs. So here you see what we refer to as our production possibility frontier. And this is, if you divert water for paddy production, you can get to a maximum production. If you divert water valuing electricity, that's up to the top. And this sort of bluish curve indicates the production possibility frontier. That's how trade-offs would get made. We then also did calculations, as I said, for diversions 0%, 50%, and 100%. And we also, the circles here, the size of the circle indicates a farmer decision to how much area to plant. Because if you had a perfectly rational actor, as sometimes is assumed in economics, well, of course you'd plant every hectare that you could. But farmers have other things that intervene sometimes. They have debt considerations. They have considerations about how much they trust that the water will be available at the time. They have options to go to the city and pick up work. So at any rate, we looked at various cropping percentages, and they're the large circle. So the large circle is 100%, grading down to basically 0%. And you can see then how that affects the differences between rice yield and electricity. And so you see, for example, diversion at D1, if we run it all down the mainstream, we get the maximum electricity. Okay. On the other hand, if on the right-hand side, the three figures on the right-hand side, if we don't divert anything down the main stem, then we can't even achieve the technically efficient possibility frontier. Okay, it has to be below it. We also looked at we looked at, just for our System H, a flagship system, and say, well, okay, what would it be just for the flagship system? And of course, if there's zero diversion to the flagship system, that's the top row in the left-hand column, then nothing happens. But you can see that the farmers do have to decide on trade-offs, because you can decrease the yield and increase the acreage, and you can see that a decision as to how many hectares to plant does affect this distribution. We did look then at the data that we had, and the data that we had for a low inflow year, roughly what we used for our simulation. And we looked at the reported cropping extent and electricity production and rice production. And you can see that dark circle there. They were very close to the technically efficient production possibility frontier, roughly 95%, and I wouldn't want to claim that that's a significant difference. So they were very, very close to the frontier. It's interesting, though, you will note that they're well below the maximum hydropower production. So they really are making a decision that rice production is very culturally important. Rice sufficiency, their policy, is very important to them. So what do we derive from this? Self-sufficiency in rice is a key policy goal, and it's reflected in their interest. We know that a large fraction of the population engages in farming. We also know, however, that Sri Lanka is very much developing along many fronts, including valuing tourism. And this requires increases in energy production. So this is not a static picture by any measure. So that they have produced rice, but at a cost of importing diesel, a lot of diesel, and it's not cheap. So again, I'm sure that in terms of economic optimization, one would question some of the decisions, but that's not what's being done. There are other things besides economics. There's a foreign exchange for oil, import, and these trade-off decisions just aren't simple. And we conclude that such a production possibilities frontier does provide a useful model to understand not just the physical constraints that occur in a system, but sort of the socio-political dynamics that affect these decisions. I will again comment that I've had a lot of help and students and postdocs, and we've had a lot of good times working on this project. Acknowledgements, again, the ADAPT SL team and our Sri Lankan partners very much appreciate the help. And also, of course, the National Science Foundation for funding the project. under their water sustainability and climate program. And I won't take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Hornberger. Our final speaker for this session is Dr. Patrick Reed. Dr. Reed is a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Cornell University. His research focuses on sustainable water management, given conflicting demands from renewable energy systems, ecosystem services, expanding populations, and climate change. Dr. Reed received his BS in geological engineering from the University of Missouri at Rolla, and he continued his graduate studies at the University of Illinois, and after graduating with his PhD from Illinois in civil engineering, he was on the faculty at the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Penn State, and then he moved on as a professor in civil and environmental engineering at Cornell. His presentation title is, "Are we sustaining the information needed to manage global food, energy, water systems?" Dr. Reed.
So actually, I think my talk is pretty complementary to the prior talks, but it's slightly different. Is that a lot of times when you see assessments or vulnerability analyses, there's this implicit assumption that the observations will either be there or that they're static or they're not necessarily anything to concern yourself about. And so I want to take a slightly different tack. And so to put it simply, ask a question: are we currently sustaining the critical information resources needed to characterize these types of systems? And what I hope to do is use what I would say simplified examples of what we think we're pretty good at, which would be operational management of floods and droughts, and see how we do there. Two examples here that I want to talk about. So I am an alumni here, so this is the land of corn, and I would also add to that computing, given that I was affiliated with NCSA when I was on campus. And so these two examples expended, thanks to Blue Waters, about 17,000 years of computing, which I thought, why not come back and share what I did with your awesome toy. And I also want to acknowledge that this is collaborative work with Eric Wood's group at Princeton and the Aerospace Corporation, Matt Farringer in particular. So two examples is, one is Global VIC. It's not to advocate for VIC, but Eric Wood's group and VIC itself is, I would say, an archetype model, a model that has been used for 20 years in climate change assessments and operational flood and drought assessments. And so taking a bit of a deeper dive. So one of the things is it's easy to get seduced into pretty global images without necessarily scratching and sniffing what happens underneath it. And then the other thing is an interesting example that builds off our evaluation of Global VIC to think about what happens if there's a threshold collapse in the availability of observations, and I will use the satellite examples. So VIC, it is a big model, potentially, and one of the interesting things, and it's common, so Moore's law is exploited more usually to increase the complexity of your model than to analyze the quality of your model. And those two things aren't necessarily going hand in hand. Adding more complexity doesn't mean that you have more fidelity, and then often you get to a threshold where you have so much complexity that you forget about the fidelity part. You just say, well, it's really big, and that would be really computationally expensive to know how good or bad we're actually doing with this model. So to take a different tack, when you look at this kind of model, what you see there, the red dot is a 1-degree grid marker. So VIC, global VIC, used for assessments, has 60,000 of those. And in each of those 60,000 cells, you have all these parameters about how you partition the energy in the water from the precipitation, from the sun, and how is that going to happen? Now, the way that the model is run operationally is typically that you have expert elicited specified parameters for these processes, and you usually run it with an implicit perfect information assumption or a deterministic forward simulation. So for this particular experiment, we actually went a little bit beyond that, and by a little bit, we went a lot beyond that. So we went in and we looked at the ranges of the possible parameters. So you see that on the left is, so here are the feasible ranges of the parameters across this global model. And then we looked at 10,000 possible combinations of parameters to get at the uncertainty of this. And so you have this large model, has a high complexity, and then the next thing is just even a basic sniff test of how well is this doing using the global runoff database. And what we're looking for is this idea of behavioral parameter sets. They meet a reasonable amount of the observed performance in the system, but that's interesting. How well have we observed the system? So those ground observations kind of determine how we view our model, and not just those ground observations, but any of the forcing data and all these other things, which all of this is embedded into any decisions that you would make off this model. So what did this encompass? So 10,000 simulations that encompassed this particular experiment, 1,000 years of computing and 2 petabytes of data, which is a lot of data. And what did we learn in this process of doing this? So I'm going to walk you through this. It's a little bit complicated. So a few things. So in terms of this, we have 10,000 potential worlds or simulations. And the one question is, how many of those actually reasonably worked? Dark blue means to black, almost all of them are greater than 10%. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. Not very many got above 10%. And then as you move to the white, you have 0 of the 10,000 worked in that particular cell. Before we get to that kind of white to black, you see all this gray. All the gray is that we don't even have enough information to even make an assessment. So in the gray, it's just we don't know. We can't make any assessment in that. And one of the other things that you have here, as you progress from this to this to this to this, we're using very mild but increasing requirements on the performance of the model. So it's not heavily constrained by the end of this. But what you see is that you get a trend from a mild metric to slightly more to slightly more to slightly more, a transition from 10% of 10,000 towards getting down to, and on average for the global, when you get to this point, only about 5% of the 10,000 samples actually were behavioral, which was surprising, I would say, to Eric and to a lot of folks. They thought the model did, I would say, better in that regard. But the other thing is you have the emergence of the pink, which means that none of the 10,000 worked, which means that in those areas, the model is not parameterized in a way that it meets the observed condition. Now, one of the interesting things is that question wasn't posed because it was computationally demanding. And so it's easy to have a lot of these particular models. And also my example here is on water quantity. If you think it's better for water quality, I wouldn't bet on it. But you'd have less observables, and I don't think the models have as much high fidelity. So if we shift even further, here's a view of the flotation curves. And so if you're not super familiar with flotation curves, you can see it basically left are floods, right are droughts, in the middle is the median, the blue is the full ensemble, and the red is the effect of conditioning on the available global runoff data. What you would like would be a case here where you get a lot of constraint. That information had a big bite, and it reduced it, and we don't really so much care about the median. We'd like that reduction to occur in the floods and the droughts. But what we've done here is we've classified this across different climate zones in the world, and then you can see that the effects are very different in different climate zones. And for example here, if you're interested in using VIC for the drought, the runoff database does nothing to constrain your uncertainty. It's that observation isn't sufficient. And actually what you see overall in a trend is, and this is not good from a hydrologist perspective, we're pretty good at the median. and we're not very good at floods and droughts. And the information that we have on hand, which is the observations, is a big culprit in that, the fact that we have such limited global runoff. Now, we're not talking about the US or Europe or places where you have the institutions, the governance, and the capability to sustain and invest in observation. But if you go to places in the countries of Africa and other areas where you both have the vulnerable populations and the instability and the inability to observe in a sustained fashion, then these are the areas that are highly impacted. So if we move and think about that, the other thing is that we're not accounting for, but you should, is the observations themselves have a lot of aleatoric uncertainty. So I call this the hippo in the weir slide, right? I suspect that this could probably have an effect on your perception of the low flow and throw off your guide curve and your calculations. Or if it eats your sensors, which happens, this is South Africa, it's a problem, and we largely ignore that problem. At a lot of places, the streamflow data is in a shack printed in paper, and we don't have any access to it. So to take that example and to build out to something maybe a little bit different is this idea of thinking about our observations as a global portfolio. And I'll just use one illustrative example. So the image here, and actually this has kind of been interestingly a topic du jour for The Economist. And I like this slide. They've been thinking about all the satellites and the fact that they've been sounding alarm bells, that there is this potential for a collapse in our capabilities and infrastructure supporting our space-based observation. Now, if you want to get more technical than The Economist, you could go to the 2007 decadal survey, which sounded alarm on the availability of Earth science missions. They came back in 2012 after 5 years. The alarm got greater. They're using words like collapse in infrastructure. So if you're thinking about that, that's sort of a threshold, right? Irrecoverable, whether it's political or technical, where you lose information and you'll never gain it again. So one of the things, just to highlight this, is a virtual experiment. So in this virtual experiment, here are 10 missions observing precipitation from space. And so in these 10 missions, what would happen if we view them as a global portfolio, not as individual missions, and we further assume that they had perfect sensors, perfect information, that everything would be combined from them to a perfect information feed, and the only thing that would limit their performance would be literally their orbiting behavior. How well do they cover the Earth? Do you think that's enough information for what we need for flood forecasting? I mean, it's the ideal of the ideal of the ideal. The other thing is, these missions are beyond design life, some of which by more than 14 years. And then if you look at the individual missions that are designed, the example would be GPM, $975 million is a 3-year design life. So in and of itself, it's kind of structurally not sustained. So what happens here, this virtual experiment? So this builds off our Monte Carlo and behavioral analysis. So we did the behavioral, we start with that, but now we're starting to change the forcing. So we change the forcing and we coarsen it from the availability of a baseline of an hour to 2 hours, and what we're doing is we're looking at the sensitivity of available data. Because one of the first questions is, how much is the model affected by a coarsening of the forcing? And we run this through our behavioral ensemble, and then we want to create a metric where we say, in an analysis, a certain set level of acceptable performance, and then what is the amount or the frequency of data as we move through here where it's fine. So this baseline largely hadn't existed because they hadn't had the ensemble. So if we move that, this is what it looks like for Earth. So for the whole global Earth, brown is bad news. That means you need high resolution, high frequency data, and the model's sensitive to it across its entire behavioral ensemble. Again, it's easy to get seduced into the brown and forget about all the gray. That's where we don't have enough information to say anything, regardless. So this sets an interesting baseline where we could actually talk to our friends or my particular collaborators at the aerospace and say, now if you're thinking about this, how would you design a satellite system? And they would say, well, we would think about coverage metrics, things like worst case gaps, so where the sensors and the availability of where it would see, and from the way that the orbit is working, how would they see the Earth? Well, that's an interesting second calculation. So one of the things that we combine in this particular analysis is this idea of coverage deficit. So you could think of this as the difference between what the model needed and the worst case gaps that emerge from this whole ideal portfolio. And again, this is a very ideal portfolio. We're assuming all 10 satellites are feeding all of their information in a perfect information system, which is very far from the truth. So just for, in this case, time delay between rainfall data and what we need is what we're looking at in terms of the axes. This is for the full constellation, acting perfectly. Brown means you still have deficit for all 10 satellites. So you have these gaps where you still have challenges. So what happens if you turn off the 4 that are beyond design life? You have a significant gap. And so one of the interesting things is that these gaps are stochastic in space and time. So that 8 hours will show up at some point in some time in a very hard to predict way, which isn't great when you're running a model and you have stochastic gaps. And it makes it for a very challenging problem. Now, one of the interesting things is, again, the gray is a depressing kind of just baseline. But when you think about this, who's in charge of this? Everyone, no one. So there's a different agency for each mission. It's one and done. So if you look at the defense and the commercial side, they do things slightly differently because they have revenue coming in, they build portfolios of satellites, they will launch. GPS has a lot of satellites in it, right? And they work at 6 nines. They have incredible requirements for the way that they operate. Earth science is very much a different creature, and it's being designed in a different way. So we had our friends at Aerospace say, well, why don't you pretend like you're going to treat Earth science like a money-making endeavor? And how could we re-optimize this portfolio? In essence, how many additional satellites from the case where we start here in the full portfolio where we have a baseline coverage deficit for 10 satellites. The scenario I just showed you is we lost 4, which takes us back up to this higher deficit, is how many additional satellites would be required to actually strongly improve the system. And it's actually not that many. You can see here in a replenished portfolio, if this was coordinated, that 8 satellites fully dominates, means better in everything, the 10 satellite baseline portfolio. The true issue here is this is a mild quantification of the institutional costs of not coordinating. The fact is we don't have global coordination on the missions. We aren't sustaining the investments in a coordinated manner. You could use a variety of different metrics, but this is an opportunity where you could invest. And the reality is, if you look at what's happening in the defense and intelligence side of things, the amount of investment here is peanuts, comparatively. A few summative comments. So this was, I would say, a best case. It's quantity, it's floods and droughts, it's what we're used to. We've been thinking about these systems. I think one of the things is it ignores a lot of the socioeconomic complexities. Just because you have a state and you can observe it doesn't mean that you have the appropriate actions. The next thing here is that there's a whole lot of other factors that are coming into this that are sources of data, demands, financial risk, evolving regulation. So if you have a streamflow series, you may not understand the underlying story of why it is what it is because of the human changes to the watershed and or the governance of that watershed. If we move and start thinking about this, how do you actually start dealing with things in water quality where you can have tipping points? So there's a lot of discussion. I mean, are we fooling ourselves? There's hysteresis in these systems, a severe amount of nonlinearity. Have we already committed ourselves to a pathway that we're multi-decades regardless of action? I mean, one of the things that I don't think is very well understood is just the responsivity of our systems to our actions. And I think that's a very difficult question, and you have to be very critical of the underlying models. I think the other thing is uncertainty isn't an option. It's a requirement. Otherwise, you are making an uncertainty assumption. You're assuming none, which is an extreme assumption, which is a common assumption. The next thing is, when you're thinking about this and trying to figure out what happens, why is the observation system static? Why can't we evolve it? Why can't we think of it from a more holistic systems perspective? And in particular, I think this last point, it's not enough to make a policy recommendation. If you don't have ex post verification that your proposed actions actually manifested into the state changes and to the actual required goal, then you're in the ether. And I think a lot of what we're doing is in the ether. So on that happy note, I acknowledge my collaborators, John Herman, Dave Hatka, and my collaborators at Aerospace, Matt Farringer at Princeton, Eric Wood, and Nate Cheney. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Reed. Well, now we have about 25 minutes or so. So all our distinguished speakers, Dr. Kai, Dr. Hornberger, and Dr. Reed, they're here. Give Dr. Reed maybe a minute or so before he finishes his glass of water there. So it's open for questions. He's a water resources engineer.
Okay, thank you. So I have a question for Professor Hornberger. I really enjoyed your talk. The question is a clarification question on the trade-off front that you showed us. So the question is, that trade-off front, is that an emergent property that came out of the functioning of the system, or was it designed? So the reason I'm asking that question is because certainly when it comes to the operation of the hydroelectric system, there are only a few decision makers. So the president of the country or the prime minister or the minister of energy or whatever, they can begin to control, they can say, do this, do that, and so on. But when it comes to the farmers, they are individual. They make their own decisions. They don't care about hydroelectric power. They just decide on a day-to-day basis what they want to do. So this decision-making is being done at many different levels, at least, certainly many different levels. And and then this issue of energy self-sufficiency and food self-sufficiency that the country is trying to promote and do some kind of a trade-off, balance. So my question again, coming back, is it an emergent behavior that you showed us, or it just is somebody manipulating the system to reach that point? And the further question is there a way to actually manipulate this in such a way that to reach some kind of a target?
So there are two questions. So the main one being, has somebody manipulated the system to reach that point? And I don't think so, okay? There, as you pointed out correctly, there are a range of decision points. I think that the main decision is taken by the Mahaveli River Authority, so it's at a high level, and that has to do with how much is diverted at the primary diversion point, Polgala. And then once that decision is made, that information is fed back down through the farmer organizations, and the farmer organizations disperse the information to farmers who then react and clearly do react in some way to maximize or nearly maximize their yield. The second question is much more complicated, right? Could we manipulate this? And so to the extent that if we had good information, perhaps not perfect information, but if Patrick had the operation of the reservoir system and some notion of how things could be operated, I have great confidence that Patrick could develop a decision support tool that could help people do that.
So I think an important theme across all the talks was the importance of understanding human adaptation. We don't live in a world where we make a change and there's a static system. And so Ximing, do you think it's possible that you could stop food waste to the point where you actually increase the supply so much that the price goes down and then people end up consuming more resource-intensive foods, actually increasing resource consumption? Could you see that as a possibility?
Okay, I don't know if I can provide a right answer for that. But if I don't misunderstand your question, I think after the Green Revolution, after 1970s, so the world put a lot of efforts on the production expansion. Although the waste and the loss was there, and also the regional famine, the regional food shortage is also there. So I would really say this is an issue of, do we ignore the problem, or we really want to pay some attention on the problem? And for your question is like, if for example, if we on one hand we try to promote food production, and then the price might going down, and on that hand there may not be that much incentive for people to save food, right? Economically that might happen, but again the issue is that, do we have some kind of regulations or policies to control the waste and to put some and also to put some infrastructure development to prevent food loss and waste. So I would say it's a policy issue, and also, of course, it's also an ethic issue. Right. Next.
Hi, this is a great session. Dr. Reed, this question's for you. So now I'm sad at that whole gray area and the brown areas. It's all bad, right? What role, if any, do you see citizen science and scraped social media playing as part of the portfolio of how we get data on water and climate?
I think, it's an excellent opportunity. It's easy for later generations to kind of make fun of the media potential right now of Twitter and things like that. But humanity is writing more text than it's ever written in its own history. And so it creates a mechanism where you can get data, but the quality of that data is challenging. And then the operational execution of decisions off that data also can be challenging. That being said, there are analogs where the Twitterverse picked up the Chinese earthquakes faster than the USGS. And so there are analogs there. I think it depends on the time scale and the complexity of the state that you're chasing. But I think on the social side, there's a lot of interesting things that can be done there, where you can start to think about, because it's not just the data in a direct sense, it's also behavioral data and things like that, which we have the potential to collect now, unlike we've ever had before.
So I have two questions. The first is to Dr. Reed. When you estimate these data, whether data could influence constrain your model. How do you count for variability of a particular field?
So what we did in that particular virtual experiment is we used TRIM as a baseline, the best available baseline, and then we took that as a relative sense and then coarsened the best available data that the Princeton group had for observed satellite precipitation, and then coarsened uniformly in each cell that data set, just to look in a coarse sense at sensitivity in terms of the frequency. And it's not shocking that flooding it strongly requires high-resolution data. But some of the other things is the soil moisture states and some of the other states in the model are also pretty sensitive to it in ways that Eric and Nate were fairly surprised by.
These are more like a local variability. Have you looked at spatial correlation of the spatial point? Presumably that influenced the spatial resolution of the measurement?
So the spatial correlation is embedded in the TRIM data. So we use TRIM, and or at least the best version of TRIM. So it's temporal and spatial signatures in it. And then we coarsened. Now in terms of how we coarsened, were we doing pattern scaling or anything fancy? No, we weren't doing anything fancy in that particular essence. But we took, in essence, a snapshot and then coarsened down from the space and time signature of the original data set.
My second question, last one. So to Dr. Kai, you mentioned the food waste and the loss. In terms of address the global demand for increasing food, is this a low-hanging fruit? For example, building storage might be expensive. Has anyone compared the cost of reduce the loss versus cost of increased production or perhaps improve technology for food production?
Okay. Actually, there are indeed some local cost and benefit analysis. But at the global scale, we really don't have we don't have any solution about that. But I think this kind of benefit cost analysis may not be the whole thing. I think we really should go beyond the benefit cost analysis. So as I talked about, actually, it provides a lot of potentials for resources saving. And that's probably, we may not have a way to assess the economic benefit associated with those resources saving. And the other thing is, consider about the future of the world with a large increase of the demand and very limited potential of production expansion. We may not have choice. And that probably also go beyond the cost-benefit analysis. So my point, as an engineer, my point is that as soon as we have clear policy, clear guidelines, the engineering, the technology could solve the problem to a large degree. And so, of course, that again, we may not be, the cost-benefit analysis may not be sufficient for us to evaluate the decisions. Thanks.
Any other questions for our three speakers, please?
This is for Dr. Hornberger. I found your very interesting presentation, and as I listened to some facets or issues that are rather dynamic, came to mind that I thought might play into your examination there. And one is, question is, you indicated that one of the government goals is to be sufficient rice. And so one of the questions that come to my mind is, what is the status of the total fertility rate and population dynamics in Sri Lanka? And the second was, I know, I'm not an authority at all, but I know there are new means of growing rice that involve much less water, I don't know whether they're being examined, but that would be of interest. And finally, is climate change. Is climate change, its impacts on Sri Lanka beginning to be clear as to whether they will have an impact? Thank you.
Could you, I have the second two, the first one, refresh my memory? Oh yeah, right, okay. So Sri Lanka population is fairly stable. It's projected, I think it's projected to grow by maybe only 5%. It is not, their population is really quite stable. The second question had to do with how rice is grown. It is typically flood irrigation right now. You are right that there are things like the Cornell system of rice intensification, and that is certainly being examined. The adoption of it is complex because it requires more labor. The weed control is an issue. And then the third one, the climate change issue. So climate change in Sri Lanka, it's arguable. They're the best data we have. Pradeep showed some data for India, and I think that the temperature increases for Sri Lanka from the data are quite similar. Perhaps a little more temperature increase. As is everywhere, changes in precipitation are much less clear-cut, and even temperature, there are some stations that show much less and some stations higher. So in the south of Sri Lanka, it looks like temperatures increased 1°C, which is quite high for that area. But other stations in Sri Lanka, I think, are more in line with what was shown for India.
Any other questions for any of the speakers? Go ahead.
Last one. I have one more question. This is really maybe for discussion. So Dr. Reed showed that failing of these satellite observing system really has almost detrimental effect on constraining the model for water resource modeling. One of the, of course, part of the reason, probably the most important reason is the cost associated with these satellite missions. And however, the cost of not having these systems are probably also enormous, but we don't have any concrete number to demonstrate that. And are there any attempt to estimate that the cost of allowing these system, the cost of without these system to the society and to economy?
So actually, I mean, that was sort of the direction that we were trying to go. The reality is it's really difficult to quantify that. And you can see many instances where saving $65,000 a year in operation and maintenance fees for stream flow is far less valuable than the stream flow itself in calculating long-term reliability or risk for the systems impacted by that stream flow. But it's a very fluid, challenging problem to do that. Because the other thing is you could do the investment in a number of ways. I mean, the satellites have a tremendous number of challenges and limitations and how that, so you could also do ground observation or combinations of how you do that. So that what baseline do you compare to is also challenging in terms of how you do that. I think also the governance. I mean, there's a tremendous assumption of governance in our observation systems. And if you start transferring where third parties are managing the observation system that are used in the operations in other countries, that creates actually complexities there too, because I mean, there are obviously opportunity costs on both sides of that equation that may not actually be complementary why am I doing something outside my zip code? And frankly, when I briefed some of this to Congress, that was the number one thing that they wanted me to answer is, what's this mean to my zip code? And so, and most of the investment is Japanese, European, or the United States. But the benefit would accrue outside of those countries.
If I may give a short comment in support of what Dr. Ximing Kai said earlier about your option questions that you asked, the saving the food versus producing more food. I think, I wholeheartedly support what he said. If you ask the economists, they will tell you that the cost of saving food is relatively so moderate in compared to producing more food. And in the next 12 years, we're supposed to have nearly about 1 billion more people on the planet. By 2050, we are predicted to have about 9.3 billion people on this planet. So what FAO says that, if we have to produce the food, we need 2 more additional countries on this world for the land that will produce the crop to feed the world. Another United States and another Canada. We don't have them. And many of the cost for example, storage technology, many of them actually are low-cost technologies, adaptability, and awareness, educating people that they can, food loss and food waste is preventable or can be reduced. So I thought I'll just share it. But anyway, I'm not the speaker, but any other questions? One last question or comment any would like to share? If not, let's give all our 3 speakers another round of applause. And